Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Unfiltered Author Talks. We are a day before Halloween, so that's why you're seeing some spooky stuff happening in the background there. There's a haunted house, there's some orange colors. It's not like us normally, but hey, you know what? It's going to be cool for tonight. We are very, very, very excited tonight to announce that we have Scott Hartwig on. Scott authored a really cool book that I've got right here for you guys to see, and you may have seen it as you've joined in. I Dread the Thought of the Place, which is about the Battle of Antietam and the days following, and it is an amazing read. But without any further ado, Scott, I want to give you the floor and let you take us away here. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how this became. It's a passion project, if I'm saying that correctly, because it's
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Scott Hartwig. I spent my career with the National Park Service, and I spent all of it at Gettysburg National Military Park. And I was in charge of the public history program that we did at Gettysburg, all the interpretive programs, the education programs. Was involved when we built the new museum and visitor center with everything about that. It's a great job, fantastic career. Couldn't have asked for a better place to live and work than Gettysburg. So, a question that I get a lot of times from people is, why did you write a book about Antietam if you worked at Gettysburg? And the first answer I give to that is because Antietam wasn't Gettysburg, because I worked with Gettysburg all the time, and you got to take a break from some of that. But also to complete my story, I retired from the Park Service in the beginning of 2014. And then at that point, I really started working full time on this book. It took me about 8 years to write it. It's
No kidding.
970 pages, I think. And like you say, Tyler, it was kind of a thing I was passionate about and a story I wanted to tell. So how did I get on to Antietam? It really was a fairly simple story. Back in the 1980s, I was working at the information desk in the old Cyclorama Center, which no longer exists at Gettysburg. And with a couple of my friends who worked there with me, we were talking about battles and campaigns of the Civil War that had not really been thoroughly covered.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time period, Stephen Sears' book which is a really good book, which came out about the Battle of Antietam, Landscape Turned Red, hadn't been published yet. So it was probably like a year before that. And, one of the battles we talked about was the Battle of Antietam. I said, Antietam has essentially two books on it. It has Francis Palfrey's Antietam and Fredericksburg, and Palfrey was a veteran of the battle. He was wounded.
Right.
And then it was Jim Murfin's book, A Gleam of Bayonets, which was written in 1962, I think.
Fantastic book.
Yeah. So that was pretty much it. And, I kind of flippantly said at that point, I said, well, I'm going to write the history of Antietam, and a little imagining what that actually meant. But that started me on the course, and I floundered around for a long time. I didn't really know what I was doing in some respects. And I learned a lot, though. I had a lot of people that I worked with who were really smart about research and knew a lot about the war. And I knew a lot of academics who were out there. And over time, I kind of honed my whole method on how to do this. And I spent about 20 years writing the first volume of this 2-volume Antietam thing, which was
no kidding. Right.
And the reason I did it in 2 volumes was, if you only write 1 volume, you're going to spend most of the volume on the Battle of Antietam, because that's the big event of the campaign. So what ends up happening almost every time people write a book about Antietam is they don't spend much time on the Harper's Ferry operation, which is the biggest surrender of U.S. troops in the Civil War and the biggest surrender of U.S. troops until Corregidor in World War II. I thought that was a really big event, and I thought that needed an in-depth treatment, which it had really never received. And then the Battle of South Mountain, and that has received some treatment, but I also felt South Mountain was deserving of an in-depth sort of study. And what I was looking for is I wanted to tell both the story of the commanders and their decisions that they make, but I wanted to also tell the story of the people who had to execute them, all the way down to the lowest rank. And And in the Antietam book, I also expand that to tell the story of how it affected the people who lived on the battlefield and the people who lived at home who had loved ones who were in the battle. But anyway, into Antietam Creek, I was raising kids, doing little league and softball and all sorts of other things, and it became kind of a joke in the Park Service that Hartwig was writing this book about Antietam. And but I'm slow and steady. I stuck at it and or stuck with it, and I eventually finished it. It was a lot of work, and when I retired from the Park Service, I could have worked a little bit longer, but I'd done everything I wanted to do at Gettysburg, and as much as I loved working there, that wasn't my identity. I have a lot
Right.
I'm interested in doing, and I wanted to have time to really dedicate. So this would be my job to work on this book, and that's pretty much the way I approached it. Is I would write Monday through Friday, take the dog for a walk first thing in the morning, get home, work on the book. Some days I had a different schedule. If I wasn't going to the Y or doing something like that, I work on the book in the morning and the afternoon. But you find that 3 to 4 hours is about the maximum you can really work and concentrate and write and be effective at this stuff. So I do that 5 days a week, and I was really steady at it. I mean, unless I was on vacation or traveling somewhere, I always did that. I take the weekends off generally, and you can get a lot done if you're consistent. If you follow a schedule.
Right.
I like having a schedule, so that really helped in writing the book. Both.
Very good. Yeah. And I'll tell you, I remember I was an intern at Fredericksburg when I got my hands on Two Antietam Creek, and I was just eagerly awaiting that second volume because I was like, man, I don't know if I'm going to be able to read this as quickly as I read normal books. That was just, it was amazing. And the South Mountain aspect of that, and you touched on Harper's Ferry too, which is also important because I had little to no knowledge about that. I'm stuck in Fredericksburg of 1860, December 1862 to be completely clear that. And then going forward to Chancellorsville, So I had an interest in Antietam, and I wanted to start at Second Manassas, and that's what I love about your book. There is that it really starts at the culmination of the end of Second Manassas and how that impacts McClellan coming back into command, so on and so forth. So when that the second one came out, I was just incredibly happy to read that second volume because it was something else.
Well, good.
And I really appreciate the work that you put into that. And I mean, again, for someone who didn't know as much about Antietam and had the I could go on Wikipedia, I can go on Google, I could read James Murphy, and that one itself is what's really opening my eyes. And later on in the podcast, I want to talk about the regulars because you mentioned that in September when I first saw you speak there, and that was like I need to go back and really go through this regulars aspects. I think you came across some really good information that never ever really hits the surface of Antietam. So that was cool.
I mean, the thing is that sometimes you can't say these books write themselves,
right?
But the research that you do informs the story that you want to tell. So, for example, the chapter that I wrote, which dealt with the U.S. regulars to the Battle of Antietam, I knew some things about the regulars because the regulars really got mauled at Gettysburg, and they were a famous part of the Army of the Potomac up to Gettysburg. But I didn't really completely understand the way that they were trained and what the early regulars in 62 and 63, what set them apart from many of the volunteer units. There were a lot of volunteer units who were as good as the regulars. The regulars were really a special unit because of the way they were trained. So the research kind of informed the story, and I didn't really understand all of that until I did the research. And that's one of the things that I love about writing history is that you uncover these things that you didn't suspect, and they help inform your story and make your story richer and more interesting.
Yeah.
And the only way I wrote about this in my author's preface is that the only way you tell some of these stories is you have to get down into the weeds. If you stay up above the weeds, if you're at the command level, you don't experience the heart and soul of the event as the people who lived it did. And when you get into the heart and soul of the event, certain stories emerge that are not part of the traditional narrative, but were really important at the time.
Okay. And one of the things too that I had to start putting in the back of my mind is you probably have, the experience a lot of authors have, but it was starting this project before COVID and then COVID happening. How was that a hurdle for you? I would like to talk to a lot of authors about that because it's a unique thing in our lifetime that many
Yeah,
have not had the experience of having to endure. And so, of course, To Antietam Creek came out before COVID ever happened. So were
yeah.
you were in the process of working on I Dread the Thought of the Place when this happened. So what kind of hurdle did that put you through?
Well,
Was there a hurdle?
yeah, that's a really good question. I had finished writing all the chapters on the battle. This is kind of ironic. When I got
Mm.
to when COVID came, I had started the aftermath of
Okay.
the battle. So I will never forget it because a lot of the research that I'm doing and the writing I'm doing is about really dark stuff and tragedy and people dealing with tragedy and taking care of the wounded and the burial of the dead and the impact upon the civilians and the home front. And the one thing that COVID did have an impact on me, fortunately, I'd done a lot of research into the aftermath before COVID hit. But once COVID hit, what I was doing before this is when I was working on the battle, I would go to Antietam National Battlefield Library. They have a
Hmm.
really good library there. You have to make an appointment and everything.
Oh yeah.
Stephanie Gray runs the library there. She was really great. And I went through every file they had relating to every unit that was in the battle. And I would scan everything that was of any interest to me. So that was my plan in the aftermath. I would have looked through every single thing that they had. And I might have been able to find a few more things, but
Hmm.
I had enough really for the aftermath that I was able to, I felt, do it justice, do the story justice. But that would be the one thing that I would love to have had the opportunity to be able to tap that resource, uh, which I don't feel like I fully tapped. I got a fair amount, but I didn't
Hmm.
fully tap it. But it because the early period of the pandemic was a very, I think for everybody, a really frightening period and
Oh
life changing
yeah.
period. And to me, it kind of informed what I wrote because Antietam, for those who lived it, was a dark period, and it profoundly affected people's lives in the way that the pandemic affected our lives.
Yeah, and I think that is a great way to put that. That's fantastic. We have some folks on the internet that are watching from worldwide. We have a Venezuelan, and
Great.
his name Fernando says hello from Venezuela. Gwendolyn
Well,
from
Fernando.
Frederick, Maryland. Frostburg, Maryland. Also, we got a hello from Joanne Peterson there. Anthony House Denton, who is from Darren's neck of the woods across the pond there in
Certainly
England, says,
is.
"Hey guys." And Derek Rupert has a comment for your bookshelf. He said, "Look at his bookshelf."
It's a mess, man. It looks like Harry Potter or something.
And I just want to step in there just a minute because I actually reenact the Fourth US Infantry here in the UK.
There you go.
So I do love the regulars.
Please.
Oh
The
yeah.
reason I love them is because we get to wear the brass scales and
Oh yeah.
I have a nice hardy hat from Dirty Billy's in Gettysburg, so it makes it worth it, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah,
It's
going back to what you're saying, Scott, about the aftermath of a battle, this is what people forget about, isn't it? You know, they. I mean, when you look at a battle, you always think of the battle, but a lot of people also forget about the logistics behind an army because these
Yeah.
armies are massive, but they always forget about afterwards. And you know, I mean, the smell after the battle must have been horrendous.
Yeah, it was. The aftermath of Antietam, it was very disturbing to everybody who
Mhm.
was there. I mean, when you read the letters and the journals and the diaries from the people who were there, and the letters that they wrote to the newspapers afterwards, you can tell that they're very disturbed by what they've seen. It's just wholesale slaughter,
Mhm.
and even when they're burying the dead of the enemy, they're hardened to it, but they're also deeply disturbed by what they're seeing. And The other thing about the aftermath is that, if you cherry pick your accounts, you can make it seem like there was no medical services after the Battle of Antietam. There was no medical services. It was just a disaster. Well, I make a point I make to people sometimes. I said, if you dump 23,000 casualties on the town of Gettysburg right now, we couldn't take care of them all.
Mm-hmm.
We could hardly take care of any of them. It would be a disastrous event, and we would be clamoring for help from all over the place, which is exactly what they had to do. So both armies had well-developed medical services, but we sometimes forget because we sometimes look at these battles in a vacuum.
Mhm.
So if you look at the Battle of Antietam, or as the Confederates called it, Sharpsburg, and you look at the Confederate medical services, you're like, wow, I mean, they were really pretty bad. Well, you forget that the Confederates had fought a major battle at Second Manassas,
Mhm.
and they had to evacuate all of their wounded from that battlefield. They also had to treat all of their wounded who were too seriously wounded to be moved from the battlefield. And they had to also deal with all the Union wounded who had been left behind when the Union Army retreated. Well, that required the Confederates to use a lot of their transportation and a lot of their medical supplies. And they left their chief surgeon, Lafayette Guild, to oversee this whole operation. So when the Confederates go up into Maryland, they don't get any resupply of medical supplies, and a lot of their transportation is being used to deal with the wounded from Second Manassas. So when you fight a battle like Antietam, and if you're a medical director in either army, you're Jonathan Letterman in the Union Army, or you're Guild. He's not at Antietam, but if he was, what you generally are trying to have your medical services prepared for is, what was the worst battle that you had fought? And the worst battle they had fought would be Second Manassas. Well, this is kind of what happens at Gettysburg as well. What was the worst battle they had fought before Gettysburg? It was Chancellorsville. So you try to have medical supplies on hand to deal with the Chancellorsville. But when you have a Gettysburg, it eclipses Chancellorsville. You have an Antietam, it eclipses Second Manassas. So the consequence is there's going to be a lot of suffering, and there was on both sides. A lot. I have in my chapter, the first chapter on the aftermath. At the beginning of the chapter, I follow 5 different wounded soldiers, 3 Union, 2 Confederate. And what I was trying to do with that is I wanted people to get a sense of the experience that a wounded soldier had. I wasn't trying to claim these 5 are typical, because every soldier had their own story and what happened to them after they got wounded. But there were themes that ran through these 5 stories, that ran through lots of stories of men who were wounded. And what I wanted people to understand is that the medical services in both armies were overwhelmed by the battle. So the ideal was, you had stretcher bearers who followed behind an infantry regiment. You detailed so many men to be stretcher bearers. It was never enough. Somebody gets hit, they go down, they're not ambulatory. Stretcher bearers go over, they pick them up, they carry them back a little ways. There's an ambulance, they put them in the ambulance, maybe with a couple other guys. The ambulance drives back to a field hospital. They start to get medical attention. That's the ideal. That's what you're supposed to have. But when you have an infantry regiment that takes 180 casualties, 160 of whom are wounded, 100 of whom can't walk, you're overwhelmed. So what ends up happening is individual soldiers, groups of soldiers, because one man can't carry one man off the field. If you've ever carried a stretcher, a Civil War stretcher, some years ago, my wife and I did a program for a group on the Gettysburg battlefield, and we had a Civil War stretcher, and we got 4 fairly husky guys on the program, and we put the smallest woman that was on the program on the stretcher, and we had them evacuate her from where a soldier, this was a New York brigade we were following in the Battle of Gettysburg, where that soldier would have been wounded to where was the closest medical attention that they could get. And those 4 guys did not make the trip. They had to get relief. So it tells you something about how difficult it was to evacuate these guys. The ambulances were overwhelmed. There weren't enough ambulances to transport all the men. So in the 5 cases that I tell the story of, all of these men make their way to medical attention under their own power. I mean, some of them is just unbelievable. Like some of these guys are shot and they walk 3 miles to get medical attention. And then some of them ended up like not getting any sort of treatment for a couple of days or 3 days. And there's a lot of horrendous conditions that they're confronted with. But the medical services, they're just absolutely overwhelmed in trying to deal with all of this. But as you read through that chapter, you realize that over time, particularly the Union medical services, really kind of came together and began to get better organized and began to evacuate the wounded from the field. And it was an incredibly complex, huge job, and they saved hundreds and hundreds of lives by the treatment that they received. So again, if you cherry pick your evidence, which a lot of times people do when they write on the Civil War or any historical event, you can say, well, the medical services were terrible. Soldiers didn't get any medical service. Oh my God, how terrible this was. Well, it was terrible, but there were medical services, and they did have a system on trying to evacuate the wounded. And the Confederate Army, it was much worse because, as we talked about, they didn't have as much transportation to get their wounded off the field. They also had to retreat, and they retreated during the night. I mean, when you start to think of the logistics of evacuating your army from its position, a lot of times the narrative is that Robert E. Lee was just audacious, and that's why on September the 18th, he held his position at Antietam and just faced down McClellan because he had contempt for McClellan. I think that's a bunch of hooey. I think that Lee stayed at Sharpsburg on the 18th because he had to. He did not want to fight a battle again. He had to stay there because his men were exhausted. His men needed some type of food because a lot of them hadn't eaten anything in a while. But more importantly, he had to establish a transportation plan to move what transportation they had to all of the field hospitals that they had, identify the wounded in the field hospitals who were capable of movement and travel, get them loaded onto the wagons, set a timetable for all of those wagons to move the wounded down to the Potomac River and across the Potomac River. It was a really complicated and huge job. And, even some guys who probably should have been transported had to walk, and then they had to leave some of their wounded, several thousand wounded who were not capable of travel. And you have to make that determination if you're the surgeon there. And you have to do all of that in one day. So, anyway, it's super complicated, big story.
Can I just ask one little question quickly? So Scott, when you're doing a book like this and you're reading those first-hand accounts, what sort of effect does that have on the person researching that? Because you're reading, like you said, some horrible stuff there. So I'd love to know, because I've never really had that opinion from someone that's written a book that has had to delve that deep and, look at that horrible stuff,
Yeah, sometimes it's depressing. Be completely honest with you. And other times, I never look at these people who lived in that era and say, they were just tougher than we were.
Oh, definitely.
Because I think every era has people who were tough and people who weren't tough. And, and I don't know that we're any less inured to people dying than they were then. They certainly had a lot more children who died in that era than we have today. But yeah, I mean, when you're reading about all this death and destruction all the time and people slaughtering each other, it can be depressing. But it's also a story that I think needs to be told.
Definitely.
So Antietam is this huge event in American history. It's the bloodiest single day. It's the event that, whether Americans like it or not, it is one of the things that drove us to emancipation. I mean, so you have this horrific battle, and Lincoln needs that horrific battle to give him the um, the political backing that he needs to issue his Emancipation Proclamation. And so I felt that the story, the whole thing, everything, the aftermath, the fighting, the trauma that it was caused to the soldiers, and it was all part of this story that if you only tell what the commanders are doing, or you're only talking about Lincoln and Jefferson Davis and those sorts of people at that level, it robs the life of the story. And it's like telling the story of the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania, and you don't tell the story of all the people who experienced the flood. You only talk about why the flood happened. So that's kind of how I look at it.
Oh, you touched on a very, very near and dear heart to both of our. Yeah, man, we talk about that quite a bit. We're actually planning on another conversation about
Oh,
Johnstown
definitely.
coming
That's
in the
gonna
future.
happen. Yeah.
I want to circle just quickly back. Walt is actually one of our regular contributors, and Restream's doing some weird stuff tonight. Not only is it giving us this cool graphics, but it's also not being so nice. We normally have more contributors to this page that are not with us tonight, but Walt is one of the regulars that we have on, and he mentioned something very interesting as well. He said, "At my job, I'll sometimes ask people what was changed for you in the last 4 years." He said, "The Civil War was the most impactful 4 years for our country, but I think people can relate to it a little more because of the pandemic."
Yes.
And I think it's a cool thing to say. And Derek Rupert is saying that just read about a surgeon at Cedar Mountain who performed 22 leg amputations on top of arm amputations and other attention given in a 24-hour period. So that's happening at Cedar Mountain. Just imagine the magnitude that is at Antietam.
Yeah, and I mean one of the things about amputations is that again the Civil War surgeons get the rap that every wound they did an amputation. They only did an amputation if the bone was shattered.
Mhm.
And I've talked to some surgeons who said, some of the wounds that these guys suffered in the Civil War, if we confronted them, we'd have to amputate too, because you just couldn't reconstruct the bone because the bone was shattered. The surgeons, I mean, they were like surgeons today. There was good ones and bad ones, and mediocre ones, and they were also dealing with just a dreadful job, and some of them drank too much. There's one of my favorite stories in the book is Theodore Diamond. He was the surgeon of the 2nd Maryland Infantry, and he just has an amazing story about how he gets tasked with setting up a hospital after the Battle of Antietam, and what he goes through to get a hospital set up is just unbelievable. And everything that he has to do is amazing. I mean, because he just doesn't have the help that he should have. Because again, these medical services, they're not completely refined. They have a system in place, but after every battle, there's an evaluation of what went right and what went wrong, and they're constantly trying to fix it. They tried in the summer of 1862 to get a dedicated medical service that soldiers would be detailed to this medical service, and it was nixed by Henry Halleck, and who was the essentially the chief of staff of the United States Army, and Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, because they felt, look, we don't need any more non-combatants. And the medical people were trying to say, but this is going to make the morale better for the soldiers, because they're going to know that they're going to be treated properly. Because what we're doing right now a lot of times is that the nurses and the orderlies and so on in the hospitals are just the riffraff of the Army, because they're the only ones we can round up, because they're the stragglers in the rear, and that's who these surgeons have to get to do these jobs to save these soldiers. So anyway, it was yeah.
No, I completely understand. And MJ Henyon says, "Good evening, all. Good evening, MJ. Thanks for joining in tonight." One of the things, and I don't know, you were signing a lot of books and busy, so I didn't get to sit down and talk to you about some of this stuff. But Antietam is also a place that I have a very special connection to, because I have ancestors that fought there, but I also am a descendant of a family that lived in Sharpsburg. If you're familiar with the McGraw family, I'm Jacob McGraw, and I think Sarah McGraw would be the other. Yeah. So I have some family there, but I also have an ancestor with Parker's Virginia Battery. So where you gave that talk on the 16th, he's wounded literally right there in front of the Dunker Church almost immediately. Not even 5 minutes into the fight, I'm sure. Now, there's still a lot I would love to try to find about his wounding, because he says he's hit by a ball and not quite sure there were musket firing going on when he was wounded. I think it had to be some piece of artillery, and he ends up in Sharpsburg and has it taken out of his leg, and he's on his way down to Fredericksburg, and will actually serve as an orderly for Lee at Telegraph Hill, kind of going back and forth between Prospect Hill. So it's a really unique story there. But that is really where I got my love for it, was finding out that, oh my gosh, this ancestor that I had really only thought fought at Gettysburg. And again, you being at Gettysburg so long, you may know this story. There's this little thing, and I hate to go on a Gettysburg tangent, but he's firing the last shot of Gettysburg under Longstreet. He's with Parker's battery there. There's a small contingent of Union forces that are moving towards some of the artillery positions there where Parker's battery was at, near the Peach Orchard. And he claims that Longstreet gave him an order to fire a little canister into him, and it checked their route, and the Union forces actually moved back and didn't pursue this position anymore. And that's the story I always knew. I didn't know of anything else in the war. That was just the big one, obviously, because it's the G word, and we all know what's going on there. But to find out, there's such a personal attachment to Antietam for him too, because he's literally wounded there, and that's where he takes his only wound of the war. And of course, being in Parker's battery, you're with S.D. Lee's guys there. That's a very tough place to be. What was it like researching and writing about the artillery bombardment in the beginning, specifically on the night of the 16th and early into the 17th that they have going on in that area there? Did you uncover stuff that we may have not seen before, or did you, what was that like for you, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, a couple things about S.D. Lee's battalion. And S.D. Lee's battalion is a artillery battalion in Longstreet's command. General James Longstreet is one of the senior commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia. And after Antietam, the Confederate Army will reorganize into Army Corps, First Corps and Second Corps. Longstreet gets the First Corps, Stonewall Jackson gets the Second Corps. At the time of the Battle of Antietam, the Confederacy did not have an authorization to create Army Corps. The biggest administrative unit in the Confederate Army was a division. So what Lee did to get around that is he just grouped his divisions into what he called a command, which could be whatever they wanted it to be. I mean, it could be any number of divisions. And so Longstreet has a command, and within his command, one of the artillery battalions that it was attached to it was S.D. Lee, Stephen D. Lee's battalion. And I think it was about 24 cannons in the battalion. So an artillery battalion, each gun is pulled by a limber with 4 horses. Then there's a caisson with 4 horses. The caisson carried extra ammunition, and the limber was the vehicle that moved the gun around. You'd unhitch the gun from the limber to fire the gun and move the horses and the limber just a little ways back. You had to keep it fairly close in order for the gun crew to get ammunition out of the limber chest, which was on the vehicle that the 4 horses were pulling. And S.D. Lee's battalion was in a very exposed position. So if you go to the visit Antietam today, and you go to where the visitor center is located, and you walk out from the visitor center, you're on S.D. Lee's position. And as you walk around and look out there, you can see that it's a great firing position, but it's really exposed. And one of the things that S.D. Lee discovered very early in the battle is his position was exposed to a crossfire. So he was taking artillery fire from the north from Union batteries of the First Army Corps, and he was taking heavy artillery fire. What I mean by heavy is there were 20-pound Parrott rifles, which fires a 20-pound shell. The heaviest guns with most of the maneuver units in the Army was a 10-pound Parrott rifle, or a 3-inch ordnance rifle, or a 12-pound Napoleon. So a 12-pound Napoleon was a smoothbore cannon. It fired about a mile. It fired a round shell. The 3-inch rifle, the 10-pound Parrott, fired a conical shell, more like a modern artillery shell. And that had a range of about 1.75 miles. A 20-pound Parrott could fire about 2 miles. And they were the ones who were firing into S.D. Lee's right flank. So S.D. Lee's battalion took really terrific losses. And what probably happened to your ancestor is they would be firing shell and shrapnel at S.D. Lee. That would be the prime. Maybe some solid shot they would fire at them, but shell and shrapnel, because what you're trying to do is take the crews out, and you're trying to take the horses out, because the horses immobilize the guns. Take the crews out, they can't fire at you anymore, right? And so they killed a lot of horses in the battery, and they killed and wounded in Parker's battery quite a few men. It was a really, really difficult place to be. Very, anytime you're under a crossfire, it's a morale demoralizing sort of thing. But
Sure.
SD Lee's battalion, what I found, they probably did more damage than any other artillery unit the Confederate Army had on the northern end of the battlefield. So a lot of times, people have written about the grouping of Confederate batteries on Nicodemus Heights that Jeb Stuart brought about. And Nicodemus Heights was to the west of where the Union First Corps advanced against the Confederate forces defending north of Sharpsburg. And that put them on the flank of the First Corps. And consequently, people thought that the batteries on Nicodemus Heights did a lot of damage to the Union First Corps. I found very little evidence of any damage that they did. I mean, certainly they did do some, but what I did find is that the Union artillery on what I call Poffenberger Hill, which was behind the Joseph Poffenberger farmhouse, just smashed the Confederate artillery on Nicodemus Heights. They would drive them off, and the Confederates would come back up, and then there would be another duel, and they would drive them off. So they were an annoyance. They were harassing, but they didn't do the damage that S.T. Lee did. S.T. Lee's battalion did a great deal of damage to many First Corps units.
Joanne has a question as well. She asked if you talk much about Clara Barton.
I didn't get into Clara Barton because I felt that her story was so well known by many people that I wanted to tell the story of some other women who played an important role in the aftermath at Sharpsburg. And right now, without my book, I can't remember some of their names who were really integral in, because there were a lot of women who came to Sharpsburg, not just Clara Barton, after the battle, because they knew that there was a need for nurses and attendants and people to write letters home for many of these soldiers. And so I wanted to tell their stories and give them some attention that they'd never gotten any attention. A lot of people didn't know anything about them unless you were really, really an Antietam aficionado.
Walt has a really interesting question. He asked, does Scott have any thoughts about the work the War Department did creating battlefield parks after the war? I was reminded because Stephen D. Lee ended up co-running Vicksburg for several years.
Yeah, I mean, if they hadn't done it, we wouldn't have all those battlefields out there today to visit. Yeah, they did. It's pretty amazing. I mean, it would have never happened had the Civil War not been such a gigantic event. And literally all the major players who were in Congress were Civil War veterans. And they wanted what they had gone through to be remembered. I mean, these were people who couldn't imagine that there was going to be a First World War or a Second World War. They couldn't imagine something like that. They couldn't imagine something more terrible than what they had been through in the Civil War. And they wanted to tell the story. The thing that's remarkable about the War Department story is that Stephen D. Lee ends up co-running Vicksburg for several years. He's a Confederate. And the Confederates were the ones who seceded from the Union, tried to destroy the country. And normally in most countries, if you're on that side, if you start a rebellion and you lose, you don't get to play any part in the telling of the history. And it is really pretty remarkable what they did. I mean, at Gettysburg, the park is created in 1895 by legislation introduced by none other than Dan Sickles. And Gettysburg was a national military park. Antietam was a national battlefield. And the difference between the two is that at Antietam, to save money, what they decided they would do is they would just buy rights of way to create a system of avenues through the entire battlefield. And the feeling at that time period is Sharpsburg's a really rural place. We don't need to worry about it. They're not going to do anything with it. So it's not going to change. And that, of course, became a big problem in the 20th century. At Gettysburg, they wanted to buy up the whole battlefield. And they actually had a predecessor, which a lot of people aren't aware of. At Gettysburg, there was an organization called the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, which was founded and organized in 1863, in the fall of 63. And they owned 522 acres of the battlefield, like Little Round Top, parts of Culp's Hills, East Cemetery Hill, where Reynolds was killed, the copse of trees. And so they turned all of that over, and they also had an avenue system. So they created a whole line of battle, how the monuments would be placed. So many of the policies of the GBMA were adopted by the War Department. And then what the War Department did was, at Gettysburg in particular, they added the Confederate side of the battlefield, which the GBMA did not have any land that included the Confederates. So they add the Confederate side of the battlefield, and then they created a battlefield commission, and they did this at all the battlefields. And the commission was made up of veterans of the battle. And then those commissioners would mark the positions of the troops, and they would write these tablets that told what the brigades and divisions and corps and batteries of the two armies did during the battle. And it was supposed to be without praise or censor. They were just supposed to be very matter of fact. They're not interpretive. They're purely informational, and they're there to mark the positions of troops. The avenues that they built through the parks, Antietam is even true of this. They try to follow the lines of battle of the army, or the positions where troops are opposing one another. So what happened at Antietam is that in the 20th century, they started having to get special congressional legislation to expand the boundaries of Antietam National Battlefield, because development started moving in there. People were chopping things down. They were building, houses. They were building sheds and big garages, and they would have just ruined the entire battlefield, or much of the battlefield, if there hadn't been an intervention there. So the War Department managed the Civil War battlefields up until 1933, when the National Park Service, they were all transferred to the National Park Service. And then we assumed responsibility for all the battlefields.
Yeah, I don't know. Ezra Carmen probably plays a pretty major part in that, especially with the tablets you have.
I just want to say, look what happened to Fredericksburg. That's what I'm going to say.
That's
yeah. Fredericksburg's a good example of
major example.
Yeah,
and what I loved about Antietam is how intact it is. It's just like literally as it was, isn't it? Near enough.
It is. I mean,
amazing place.
But again, all these places had, human beings did a lot of things to change stuff. So after the Battle of Antietam, the landowners chopped down almost all of the West Woods, the North Woods, and the East Woods.
I wondered about that, because the dimensions today aren't what they were in 62 by any means, right?
They've replanted so that the replanting is recreating the dimensions.
Okay.
As long as the park has control of the land. So there's a part of the East Woods where the East Woods extended to. That's still private land.
Right. I think I know exactly where you're talking. The little house that's still sitting right there. Yep.
Yeah. And the National Park Service has no money to acquire land. I mean, a lot of people imagine it's the federal government, so they should be able to buy up this land. It's a big deal buying land up, because it takes land off the tax rolls. People get upset about that. But the Park Service has no money. So the way most of this land gets acquired is the Battlefield Trust.
They're integral to a lot of
the
these
landowners, finds a willing landowner or a willing seller, and then buys the property, and then eventually turns the property over to the National Park Service. I just wanted to circle back to something, Tyler, that you mentioned about Ezra Carmen. Is Ezra Carmen is in the Battle of Antietam, he's the colonel of the 13th New Jersey Infantry, Carmen was a veteran. He had fought in the Peninsula Campaign with, I think, the 7th New Jersey. He left that regiment to take a commission as colonel of the 13th. The 13th was a new regiment raised in the summer of 1862. And most of these new regiments raised in the summer of 62 received literally no training or minimal training before they were sent to the army in the field. So Carmen's regiment is in the Battle of Antietam, and it fights to the end of the war. I mean, they end up being transferred out to the Western Theater. They're in the Atlanta campaign, the March to the Sea, all that sort of stuff. And Carmen has a really long experience in the war. After the war, in the 1890s, he becomes the government historian of Antietam, and his job on the Antietam National Battlefield is to mark the positions of the troops of the two armies. And he just did a fantastic job. He was a really thorough historian. So he had a system. So his system would be, he would send you, if he knew you were in Parker's Battery, he would send you or you were in the 4th U.S., he'd send you a letter with a series of questions on there. So he didn't just want you to say, like, what do you remember about Antietam? That's the worst thing you could ever do with a veteran.
Oh yeah, so he got specific with it, and
he got very specific with them. He'd go out on the battlefield with a lot of these people. So, to make a long story short, he had either met with or corresponded with soldiers in every unit who's in the Battle of Antietam, and then he proceeds to write all the tablets that you see. If you visit Antietam, you're driving around, and it says, Phelps's brigade was 125 yards north of this position. They moved to the fence row in front of you, and then they blah, blah. He wrote all of that. And how did he know they were 100? Well, he got out there with the veterans, or he sent them a really detailed map, and they marked where they were. He also did 2 maps on Antietam, kind of hour-by-hour position maps, 1904 and 1908. And they sent the 1904. This had to cost them a fortune.
I'm sure.
These beautiful full-color 1904 maps to hundreds of veterans across the country, and asked the veterans to look at the map and verify if they were accurate. And the veterans would write in their criticisms of the map. Carman took all those criticisms and he revised the maps, and that was the 1908 version. They're probably some of the best maps of any Civil War battle.
Those aren't the ones that are in the published Carman manuscripts, are they?
Yes,
they are. Okay, they're fantastic. Yep.
Tom Clemens edited the Carman manuscript, and he used Carman's maps in there. For anybody who's interested, you can download the maps from the Library of Congress website. They have all of the Carman maps there. I think they're called the Antietam Battlefield Board maps, but they have all of Carman's maps for the battle. They're fantastic maps. Anyway, Carman also wrote a 1,800-page manuscript about the Maryland campaign and Battle of Antietam. That was fantastic. He wrote about Chickamauga. He wrote all these different things. He never published any of them, but he was a very good writer. He was a very thorough historian. And but fortunately for us, most recent is Tom Clemens, who's a really great historian who lives in Keedysville, Maryland. Tom edited all of Carman's manuscripts and published them through Savas Beatty Publishing.
That's right.
So you can read what Carman wrote now. And
that was one of the, so I had Murfin's book was the first one I ever really dove into, even though I knew Sears's Landscape Turned Red was out there, but I picked up the Gleam of Bayonets and went through that. And then the next 3 that I read was Tom Clemens's treatment with Carman, with the editing that he did. And I think that's where it starts to click a little bit, because you're right. Carman wrote so well and really helps to just specify where everything's at. And that's the thing. If you've been to Antietam and you can walk those grounds, if you can read specific locations of troops and the movements that are happening, because he doesn't get bogged down with a lot of floral writing, if you will. It's not like a huge narrative, but it flowed well, and it was able to.
Well, another thing about Carman that is actually rare in that era, he's not a trained historian or anything. He's extremely objective. And that is rare, because typically what you'd find, he's a Union veteran. He's going to probably favor the Union guys. He's going to, be more favorable in the story that he tells about them than he is about the Confederates. I found them to be extremely objective on both sides, all leaders, criticizing where I thought criticism was completely justified, and being judicious with his praise. So he had the bona fides because he had this long experience in the Army and in all these battles of the war. It also helped him when he would be corresponding with veterans, because since they knew he was a veteran and had been in the battle and had been in many battles, they tended to not want to tell as many tall tales with him as they might with some other people.
He knew as a veteran. He knew. Andrea's asking an interesting question. She asked, wondering if you can tell me where Colonel Francis Barlow fell at Antietam. I knew that was coming, AQ. Knew that was coming. She's a Barlow fanatic, so it's a good question, though. Where he fell at Antietam and roughly what time of battle? And had you heard that he was taken out by a sharpshooter ordered by Longstreet? I read in one post-war account in one of his obituaries.
The latter part of that is a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
First off, Longstreet there was all sorts of smoke and chaos and confusion, and he had no idea who Barlow was. There was a whole lot of people everywhere shooting at each other, and Longstreet was, for a time, probably, several hundred yards away from Barlow. But anyway, so Barlow, his regiment is the one that ends up outflanking the sunken lane. It was getting close to noon when that happened. They outflanked the lane. The Confederates retreat out of the lane, and then Barlow and his regiment, the 5th New Hampshire, the 81st Pennsylvania, some other Union regiments, enter the Big Piper cornfield. So if you go to Antietam and you are standing at the sunken lane and you turn your back on where the Union soldiers were approaching and you look to the south, that's the direction the Confederates retreat in. And everywhere you're looking there is a gigantic cornfield. So we all think of Antietam, that the cornfield on the north end of the battlefield, where there's all this heavy fighting on the morning of the 17th, is the cornfield. Well, there's Samuel Mumma had a big cornfield. Sam Piper had a big cornfield. Otto had a big cornfield at the southern end. There's a lot of cornfields at Antietam. And Piper had a very large cornfield that the Confederates used for concealing themselves as best as they could when they were trying to reinforce the lane, and also when they were trying to get out of it. Barlow and his regiment go into that cornfield, and the Confederates tried to mount these counterattacks against them in the cornfield because the Confederate line had been really shaken and disorganized, and they were just organizing these ad hoc, small-scale infantry assaults and hurling them against the Federals. And they also assembled some artillery that was firing canister and shrapnel at the Federals. And Barlow writes that he was injured in the thigh. He said, I'll tell you, he says, I was in the war for 4 years, and he says, I couldn't tell the difference between canister and shrapnel. So he said, I don't know what it was. It was one of the two. The surgeon who took it out said it was about the size of an English walnut. And that sounds like it might have been canister, but it also could have been shrapnel. A lot of times surgeons, when they would take shrapnel out of somebody, it's a shrapnel ball. It's a round iron ball. They would think it was a musket ball. So they would record that soldier as having a wound from small arms when actually it was from artillery fire. But anyway, Barlow was hit by an artillery round. It was probably shrapnel. He said it burst near him, and it sent a round into the vicinity of his groin, and he probably bled a fair amount from that wound, and then had to be evacuated from there. So, and again, he probably was carried off the field by some of his men. He may have mentioned that in the letter. I don't remember if he did. But yeah, there's a lot of these stories afterwards. I mean, every officer who becomes prominent after the Civil War is over, who gets hit during the war, is shot by a sharpshooter. They're always shot by sharpshooters.
And I would hope a sharpshooter's aiming for more than just a thigh, too, at the same time. Like,
right now, it's not to say there weren't sharpshooters.
Sure.
The general, I just forgot his name, the Confederate general in the south end of the battlefield who got killed, commanded one of A.P. Hill's brigades. Not Greg, it was the other. Anyway, I'll think of it. He was almost certainly killed by a sharpshooter because in several accounts, Confederate soldiers mentioned that he raised his field glasses up to look at the Union lines, and when he had his field glasses up, they got him. And when you read about sharpshooters, not just in the Civil War, but in all subsequent wars to that, the glint of light off field glasses is oftentimes sharpshooters would just be sitting there waiting, and they'd see that.
That was their shot.
That was their shot. Yeah.
Makes sense. Now, we are coming into our hour here. I would like to ask you, out of everything you've researched, out of everything you've done for this book, what was the most prominent takeaway that you have from this? So what sticks out the most of everything you've done? And this can be answered in both volumes. So if this is something that applies to Antietam Creek more than it does with I Dread the Thought of the Place, that's fine too. But I would love to know what really stuck with you from this, because writing a book, you learn a lot too. You do.
You do. It's hard for me to pick and say this is what really jumped out to me. Is I guess one thing I learned out of this is that the people in that era weren't that much different than we are, and they weren't heroes. They weren't some unique group of people that was different than we are. They were just as afraid as we would be. There were just as many cowards. There were just as many heroes. They were very resilient because they had to be resilient. They didn't really have a choice. They whether you were somebody working in the hospitals or a person in Sharpsburg or a soldier on the front line, you just had to deal with it. You had to deal with these things, and the resiliency of the human spirit is inspiring in a book like this, even though it is also about destroying human beings and slaughtering people. And the humanity comes out amongst a lot of these people. And so it's hard for me to pick a specific thing that comes out of this, because as I told my wife when I was working on it, every chapter that I would work on, I would come up and I'd finish it. I'd say, that was my favorite chapter. That was my favorite chapter.
Right.
I learned so many things in that chapter. That was such a great chapter. And I kind of felt that about the whole book. I mean, I loved telling the story, and I loved learning the story and sharing the story with people.
And you do it so well too. And that's something I'm glad that was, I guess your takeaway from that is because you did that. You literally humanized a battle that often would be looked at as sort of a numbers game, if you will, because a lot of us look at this is the bloodiest battle. This is how many casualties. And in saying that, you're taking away from the human experience. So what I think you've done that a lot of these books have not been able to capture yet is the human story of Antietam. What it was, it really does. It gives you a kind of a feeling when you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that you really try to hone in on the individual soldier too, down to the very lowest rank that are executing the orders from the top. You're humanizing that. Because of course, when we get into generalship and leadership, we're looking at criticizing decisions or criticizing people's orders, whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, somebody is experiencing this, and this day could be a definitive moment in their life. This could be their life defining moment. It could be their life ending moment. So to bring that to a human level and really tell the story from their eyes is what really is important. And I love when someone can do that. And again, you did that amazingly. So, I mean, I can't thank you enough for the treatments that you've done. And I know the community is just equally as appreciative of a study like this. This is awesome.
Well, thanks.
Absolutely. Darren, do you have any last minute questions for Scott before we head out today?
Yeah, really and truly, what I'd like to know is how long it takes Sharpsburg to recover from, the aftermath of the battle. Obviously, the war still goes on for a few years, but how long does it take them to get back to some kind of normality and, get up and running again?
I mean, for a lot of people, it was probably about a year. So, for example, I found an account from a Union soldier who, during the Gettysburg campaign, kind of deviated away from the army and went over to Sharpsburg to see where his unit had fought. And he ran into Sam Mumma, whose farm was burned. Confederate troops burned the farm because they thought Union sharpshooters were going to use it. So they burned the farm down, and so Mumma lost everything. The only thing he had was a gold watch that he had kept. And he got there and he ran into Mumma, and Mumma had his fields plowed. They were rebuilding his home and his barn, and he kind of had his feet underneath him again and was making a go of it. So in some ways, Mumma is an example of somebody who They were, as I said, a lot of these people were very resilient. But then there are others who, Sam Pry, who McClellan made his battle headquarters at his farm. Pry, the whole battle causes him so many financial difficulties afterwards. He ultimately sold his farm and moved to, I think, Tennessee. So you find some people who they don't really completely recover from the battle. There was a lot of people who got sick afterwards because the Union Army remained in the Sharpsburg area for over a month after the battle, and they brought all their disease with them. And a lot more people died in Sharpsburg as a result of the Battle of Antietam than died in Gettysburg, because there was a lot of disease that claimed a lot of lives. So I would say, it depended on the person. For some people, it could be a number of years before you really recovered. And for others, within about a year, even in some cases, months. Like Ezra Carman, not Ezra Carman, another officer who was in the 20th Massachusetts, returned to the battlefield in October of 1862. And he said he had a hard time finding the position that his unit fought in, because he said they'd repaired the fences, they cleaned up all the battle damage, and he didn't recognize some of the landmarks. So in some cases, they recovered pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It just varied.
Yeah.
And then Joanne says, very interesting. Thank you from both me and my husband, Tom.
Well, thank you, Joanne.
Yeah. Well, Scott, thank you again so much for coming on to talk about this. Sure. And where's the best place for anybody to get this book that hasn't already? Because I see almost daily on Facebook, people are posting, but I finally got my copy, or I'm getting my copy. But for those who don't have it and might want it, where would you recommend them going to get it?
Well, your local bookstore is probably, if you still have one, is probably the best place to get it. The easiest place to get it is probably Amazon or Barnes and Noble. I don't even know if Barnes and Noble is selling it. Maybe they are. Amazon certainly is.
Sure.
You can get it from Johns Hopkins as well. I mean, they have it. You can get it right from the publisher. So whatever's the easiest way for you to get it. I mean, as I've told numerous people about this, I didn't write this book to tell an untold story. I didn't write this book to become known or famous. I don't care about any of that stuff.
Right.
I wrote this book because I wanted to tell a story, and I wanted people to read the book, and I wanted the book to be readable. So,
and it very much is.
I'm interested in is people reading it. That's my goal.
Well, that's perfect. Like I said, you did a great job with that. So, folks at home, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Scott, again, thank you so much for popping on with us tonight and really just talking about history and something you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And folks, you guys have a great rest of your evening. Have a great week, and we will see you.